चैट चेक करें, चैट पहले आ रही है कि नहीं। होप करें नेट हमारा स्टेबल रहे, उसके बाद अपनी चालू करते हैं जो भी करेंगे। हाँ, यस, आ रहा है भाई, बढ़िया। अब एक काम करते हैं जल्दी से।
I'd have job offers lined up. But
In this course, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know to get started using SQL. Now, SQL is a language which is used to interact with relational database management systems. And a relational database management system is basically just a software application which we can use to create and manage different databases. And so we're going to talk about all of this stuff in this course. We're going to start off with the basics. So we'll just look at what is a database. We'll talk about the different types of databases. We'll talk about what SQL is and what it actually means and how you can use it to create databases. And then we're going to go ahead and we're going to install something called a relational database management system, which, like I said, is just software that we can use to manage a database. We're going to install a relational database management system called MySQL. And MySQL is one of the most popular database management systems for beginners and also just in general. And so MySQL is a great first system to learn. And so once we have that all installed, then we'll start writing SQL. And so we can write out little SQL code, little queries in order to create databases and create database tables and input information, retrieve information. And then we're going to get into writing SQL queries. And queries are used to query a database. So we'll create a database, we'll populate it with information, and I'll show you guys how you can write these little SQL queries to get specific pieces of information. So we'll start off with the basics and we'll just learn all of the fundamentals, and then I'm going to show you guys some more.
तो गाइस मैं यहाँ पे, ये बंदा माई एसक्यूएल यूज करेगा लेकिन मैं यूज करूंगा SQLite 3 क्योंकि मेरे पे वो इंस्टॉल्ड है पहले से और मुझे उसका आइडिया बेहतर है कि उसमें कैसे करेंगे। कमांड सेम फॉलो करेंगे अपन लोग, तो चालू करते हैं।
Advanced techniques to getting information out of a database. And finally, I'm going to show you guys how you can actually design database schemas. So a database schema is basically
चलो
just like
ठीक है, पहले
all
ये
the different tables and all the different relations that the database is going to store. And if you don't understand what any of that means, don't worry, we're going to cover all of it. But this course will cover basically everything about SQL, all of the fundamentals, all of the things that you need to get started. And we'll also look at database design and schema design. So it's going to be a pretty awesome course. I'm excited to be bringing you guys this stuff. And just know that all of the code, all the stuff that's in this course is going to be available on the Draft Academy website, draftacademy.com. And there's also going to be just what data.
ये भाई क्यों, हे भगवान, हाय।
Databases are in general. We're going to talk about how databases are used, why we use databases, and the different types of databases that you'll find out in the world. So this should basically just give you a
टाइम स्टैम्प देखता हूँ इसका, कहाँ से काम की चीज स्टार्ट होती है। व्हाट इज डेटाबेस टेबल्स एंड कीज, बेसिकली हमारा कहाँ से स्टार्ट होगा।
in this tutorial. We're going to look at some of the core concepts in relational databases. So we're going to talk about how we store information in relational databases, namely in tables. We'll talk about the different things about those tables. We're going to talk about things called keys. We're also going to look at rows and columns. We'll talk about how different tables can be related to each other and how we can define relationships between tables. So this will really just give you guys a full introduction into some of the core concepts of relational databases, which you can then apply when creating your own relational database using a relational database management system. So let's get started. Over here, I have an example of a table. And this is a student table. And so the student table defines specific information about a student. So up here we have the column names. So the student ID, the name of the student, and then the major. So I'm storing 3 pieces of information about each student, right? They have their ID, their name, and their major. So over here we have Jack, his student ID is 1, and he's majoring in biology. Down here we have Claire, her student ID is 3, and she's majoring in English. So all tables in relational databases are going to have 2 things. They're going to have columns and they're going to have rows. Now columns are these vertical sections right here. So a column would define a single attribute, right? So we have our name column, and inside the name column we have the names of all the students. We have the major column. Inside the major column we have the majors of all the students, right? Makes sense. And then we have rows, and a row is an individual entry in the student table. So a row or a horizontal entry would represent a single student, right? So in a single row, we're storing the student ID, the name and the major. So the columns represent a single attribute and the row represents an entry or an actual student. Whenever we're creating a table in a relational database, we always want to have one very special column, which is called the primary key. And a primary key is basically an attribute which uniquely defines the row in the database. So it's an attribute about a specific entry which will uniquely define it. So over here, we have student ID. And you'll notice that I colored this in red and I also underlined it. And this underline is basically going to specify that
बेसिकली हर किसी का रोल नंबर डिफरेंट होता है ना, वही बात कर रहा है प्राइमरी की में। तो प्राइमरी की आपकी यूनिक ही होनी चाहिए भाई, वही है।
this column or this attribute of the student is going to be the primary key. In other words, we can use this attribute to uniquely identify a specific row. So over here we have Kate, and she's a sociology major and her ID is 1, right? So we would say that Kate's primary key is 1. Now let me show you guys why primary keys can come in handy. So down here inside of these gold squares, I have two entries in this
Number
database.
1.
So we have two students, both of which are named Jack and both of which are biology majors. Now, this isn't that, special of a case, right? You can imagine that in a school you might have two students with the same name who are the same major. But in this case, how can we differentiate between this guy and this guy? Well, we can use this primary key. So even though the name and the major of this row in the table are the same as the name and the major of this row, the student ID is different. The primary key is different. And that's the whole point of a primary key, is that the primary key is always going to be unique for each row in the table. So even if all of the attributes of the row are the same, the primary key won't be, and therefore we can differentiate between the two rows, right? So I could differentiate between this Jack and this.
तो सिंपल ये कह रहा है कि इसमें जैसे नेम और मेजर प्राइमरी की नहीं है, तो इसमें सेम हो सकते हैं सब, कि जैक और जैक हो सकता है, बायोलॉजी बायोलॉजी हो सकती है, इंग्लिश सोशियोलॉजी एक और इंग्लिश हो सकता है। लेकिन स्टूडेंट आईडी तुम्हारी प्राइमरी की है तो वो तो यूनिक रहेगी अपनी।
This Jack by referring to their student IDs. And so generally, whenever we have a table in a relational database, you always want to define a primary key. And a primary key can be anything. It can be a number, it could be a string of text, it could really be anything that you want, but it has to uniquely identify the specific row. So in other words, another row in this student table couldn't have a primary key of 2. So down here I have another example of a database table. This is a user table. So just like that student table, except it's storing information about users. So over here we have email, password, date created, and type. So email is going to be our primary key. You can see I put that in red and I also underlined it. And these emails are unique to each entry in the table, right? So fake mail at fake.co, no other rows in this table could have that exact email. And then over here, we're storing the password. We're also storing a date. So a lot of times in databases, you can store date values or time values. And then over here, we're storing a type. And so basically, whenever you want to store data, what you're going to do is define a table. So you're going to define, all this information up here, and then you'll just insert specific pieces of information into that table. And so over here,
बस चेक कर लेते, चल रही है ना, ये बढ़िया चल रही है यार।
here we have one more example of a database table, and we're actually going to be looking at this example as we go forward. So this is an example of an employee.
बाकी टैब्स क्लोज कर देते हैं जो यूजलेस वाली है। हाँ, ये तो अपनी चैट ही थी।
So imagine that we had like a company database and we were storing information about employees. So we have the employee ID, which is the primary key. We're storing first name, last name, birth date, sex, and each employee. This employee ID, this is what we would call a surrogate key. And a surrogate key over here. So employee ID, this is just a, some sort of random number that we've assigned to each employee, right? This employee's ID is 100, this employee's ID is 101, etc. And this over here, this employee ID, this is what we would call a surrogate key. And a surrogate key is basically a key that has no mapping to anything in the real world, right? It's essentially just, like in this case, a random number that we assign to an employee, right? So this employee, Jan, has an employee ID of 100, right? That doesn't necessarily mean anything. 100 is just a value that we're using to represent Jan inside of the database. And so we would refer to that as a surrogate key, which is just a type of primary key. Surrogate key is a key that has no mapping to anything in the real world. We can also have something called a natural key. And over here, you'll see that I have the same exact table, except instead of having employee ID, I have employee SSN. And SSN stands for social security number. So social security number, we have something called.
तो सरोगेट की क्या है, प्राइमरी की का टाइप है, लेकिन जस्ट ये इसका कोई मैपिंग नहीं है कि जैन चलते इससे रिलेटेड है 100 से, माइकल 101 से रिलेटेड है, ऐसी कोई, या फिर जॉश 102 से रिलेटेड है, ऐसी कोई मैपिंग स्पेसिफिक नहीं है इसमें।
I have employee SSN, and SSN stands for Social Security Number. So Social Security Number is a number that we use here in the United States in order to uniquely identify each citizen. So in this case, we're using the Social Security Number in order to uniquely identify each row in the table. In other words, we're using the Social Security Number as the primary key of the table. And this is an example of what we would call a natural key. And this is a key that has a mapping or has a purpose in the real world, not just in the database. So a lot of times you'll hear people refer to surrogate keys or security number, security number. So as a employee ID, I have employee SSN. And SSN
क्या हुआ भाई? चल तो रही है.
stands for Social Security Number. So Social Security Number is a number that we use here in the United States in order to uniquely identify each citizen. So in this case, we're using the Social Security Number in order to uniquely identify each row in the table. In other words, we're using the Social Security Number as the primary key of the table. And this is an example of what we would call a natural key. And this is a key that has a mapping or has a purpose in the real world, not just in the database. So a lot of times you'll hear people refer to surrogate keys or natural keys, and that's the difference. A surrogate key is a primary key that has no mapping to the real world, and a natural key is a key that has a mapping to the real world, just like Social Security Number. So those are kind of the two different types of primary keys that you might see.
तो प्राइमरी की दो टाइप है. पहली है सरोगेट की और है दूसरी नेचुरल की. सरोगेट की मैपिंग नहीं होती है, नेचुरल वाले की मैपिंग होती है, जो आप नॉर्मल प्राइमरी की देखते हो, मतलब जो नीडेड होती है टेबल के लिए. सरोगेट की यूज तो नहीं की जाती, मैंने भी नहीं देखी वहीं पर ज्यादा, पर यही दोनों होती है.
Being stored. Another thing I want to talk to you guys about are what are called foreign keys. And a foreign key is basically a attribute that we can store on a database table that will link us to another database table. So over here, I have this same exact employee table, and then I also have this other attribute over here, branch ID. And you notice that I colored this in green. And this is what we would call a foreign key. And a foreign key stores the primary key of a row in another database table. So here we have our employee table, and I'm defining information about the employee. But let's say that an employee belongs to a specific branch in our company, right? So a company might have different branches, and we can store the information about what branch the employee belongs to inside of a foreign key. So the foreign key over here is actually a primary key inside of another table, in our case, a branch table. So let me show you guys that. So down here, we have this branch table in our database, right? So the branch is its own separate table, right? And we have, the branch has a primary key over here, which is 231, and the branch names are Scranton, Stanford, and Corporate.